Königliche Hoheit, dear Mary Miss, very welcome to you. Liebe International Patrons of the Pinakothek der Moderne natürlich. Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde der Kunst, herzlich willkommen an Sie alle. Das wird heute wahrscheinlich meine kürzeste Begrüßung, denn wir wollen gleich in medias res gehen. Es ist ein wunderbarer, ein wichtiger Moment für die Pinakothek der Moderne, für die Sammlung Moderne Kunst, weiter zu sammeln aus so einem schönen Anlass mit Blick auf den Geburtstag von Ihnen, Herzog Franz. Schön, dass Sie dabei sind, und ich wünsche Ihnen allen mit dem, was Sie gleich oben sehen werden, tiefe, starke Eindrücke. Ich übergebe Stantepede an Frau Hein, die Sammlungsleiterin für die Kunst, zweite Hälfte des 20. Jahrhunderts. Vielen Dank, ich wünsche viel Einsichten.
Königliche Hoheit, sehr geehrter Herzog Franz, sehr geehrte International Patrons, stellvertretend Vorstandsvorsitzender Herr von Südow, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie herzlich zu diesem besonderen Abend, bei dem das Werk einer amerikanischen Künstlerin im Mittelpunkt steht, die eigens für diesen Abend nach München gereist ist, Mary Miss. A very warm welcome to you, Mary Miss. It is an honor to have you here in Munich. Als Sammlungsleiterin für die Kunst der zweiten Hälfte des 20. Jahrhunderts freue ich mich sehr, für das anschließende Gespräch zwischen Mary Miss und Tatjana Schaefer einführende Worte zu sprechen. Denn in der Tat ist heute ein Ehrentag. Mit dieser Veranstaltung übergeben die International Patrons of the Pinakothek ein Geschenk an Sie, Königliche Hoheit, die eindrückliche Installation Notes von Mary Miss. On behalf of the team of the Collection of Modern Art, we would like to express our deep gratitude to you for the important new acquisition of the work Notes for the Bavarian State Painting Collections. We are thrilled to have the possibility, as the first European museum, to present this work in our collection display Mix and Match from today on. Seit der Gründung der International Patrons im Jahr 2010 sind Sie, Königliche Hoheit, mit diesem Freundeskreis von Kunstenthusiasten eng verbunden. Neben verschiedenen Aktivitäten und Förderungen ist es besonders die Ausstellungsreihe Königsklasse auf Schloss Herrenchiemsee, die Dr. Corinna Thierolf, und ein herzliches Willkommen an Sie, initiiert und kuratiert hat und die das Anliegen der International Patrons hervorhebt, Kunst an neuen Orten zugänglich zu machen, zu den Menschen zu bringen und Synergien zu schaffen. Ein großer Dank an das Engagement der International Patrons. Das ist ein Applaus wert. Diese Synergien sind in gewissem Sinne Verdichtungen. Man könnte sagen Knotenpunkte, wo Energien zusammenfließen. Mit Knoten arbeitet auch Mary Miss. Knots ist eine Installation aus 100 Knoten aus Hanfseilen, die sie 1968 in ihrem Atelier in New York ausgelegt hat. Die 1944 in New York geborene Künstlerin studierte an der University of California und am Maryland Art Institute of Baltimore. Wie wir im Gespräch gleich erfahren werden, hat Mary Miss in ihrer Karriere, die sich über mehr als 5 Jahrzehnte erstreckt, mit einer Bandbreite von künstlerischen Konzepten gearbeitet. Ansätze von Minimal, Conceptual und Land Art verbindet sich mit sozial engagierten Projekten im städtischen Kontext. Diese Grenzverschiebung zeigt sich in ihrem vielfältigen Einsatz von Materialien und Medien, ebenso wie in ihrem künstlerischen Anliegen, das den öffentlichen Raum als Spiegel gesellschaftlicher Fragestellungen zur Diskussion stellt. Mary Miss war an zahlreichen Ausstellungen beteiligt, unter anderem im Kunstmuseum der Harvard University, in der Brown University Gallery, im Institute of Contemporary Art in London sowie 2020 in der von Anke Kemkes kuratierten Gruppenausstellung Dimensions of Reality, Female Minimal in der Galerie von Tadeusz Ropacz, in der auch die Arbeit Nots zu sehen war. In dieser der Minimal Art zuzuordnenden Arbeit sind einzelne Knoten in einem strengen Raster ausgerichtet. Die Endpunkte weisen in unterschiedlichen Richtungen. Die formale Klarheit öffnet ein Assoziationsfeld, ein Netz an Möglichkeiten. Man könnte an Ganglien des Nervensystems oder an Datenströme denken. Doch mit dem Wissen über Mary Miss' Lebensmittelpunkt kommt einem New York in den Sinn, das auch Sie, Königliche Hoheit, gut kennen. New York und das zugleich übersichtliche und unüberwindliche Straßennetz, wo eine Kreuzung zum Knotenpunkt wird, wo menschliches Zusammenleben und vor allem Beziehungen unter dem Brennglas sichtbar werden. Mary Miss ist eng mit dieser Stadt verbunden. Ihr künstlerischer Fokus liegt auch auf Community-Projekten, in denen sie unterschiedliche Gruppen zusammenbringen vermag. So beinhaltet die Interaktion auch weitere Facetten des urbanen Lebens. Manchmal muss auch ein Knoten aufgelöst werden. Ich verweise auf das Augsburger Gnadenbild Maria Knotenlöserin von 1700, eine singuläre Ikonographie. Maria löst die Knoten eines Seidenbands durch Geduld und Intuition. Es entsteht eine schwungvolle Linie, vergleichbar mit den Linien oder vielmehr den Schleifen von Sigmar Polke. Denn Mary Miss' Arbeit ist im Rahmen unseres Ausstellungskonzepts Mix and Match mit Sigmar Polkes Schleifenbildern von 1986 präsentiert. Sigmar Polke, einer der Protagonisten der deutschen Kunst seit den 1960er Jahren, ist auch für sie, Königliche Hoheit, ein wichtiger Künstler. Schon früh haben sie neben Zeichnungen großartige Gemälde erworben, die gerade auch in der zu ihren stattfindenden Ausstellungen ungekämmte Bilder zu sehen sind. Die Schleifenbilder waren Teil von Sigmar Polkes legendärer Präsentation im Deutschen Pavillon der Venedig-Biennale von 1986 und wurden gemeinsam mit dem Galerieverein erworben. Atenor betitelt, ging es Polke in dieser komplexen Installation auch um Alchemie. Auf 8 großformatigen Leinwänden experimentiert er mit Pigment, Silber, Sepia, Graphit und Firnis und zitiert Albrecht Dürers Holzschnitt der Triumphwagen Kaiser Maximilians I. von 1522. Die Schleifenornamente, das sind sozusagen die direkten Zitate, dienten zur Ausschmückung für die Personifikationen von Tugenden, wie Ratio, also die Vernunft, Audatio, die Tapferkeit, um nur 2 zu nennen. Mit Mary Miss Knots, die man auch als Sinnbild für menschliches Zusammenleben lesen kann, ergibt sich ein sehr spannender Dialog. Diese eindrucksvolle Kombination ist von Tatjana Schaefer kuratiert. Sie wird gleich das Gespräch führen. Tatjana Schaefer ist durch die großzügige Förderung der International Patrons, auch hierfür gilt unser großer Dank, seit 2018 als Assistenzkuratorin für die zweite Hälfte des 20. Jahrhunderts der Sammlung Moderne Kunst tätig und hat zahlreiche Ausstellungen intensiv wissenschaftlich begleitet. Sie hat an der Goldsmiths University of London studiert und beginnt gerade ihre Promotion am Courtauld Institute, ebenfalls in London. In ihrer kuratorischen und wissenschaftlichen Praxis legt Tatjana einen besonderen Schwerpunkt auf postmoderne und feministische Künstlerinnen und setzt sich für eine stärkere Sichtbarkeit ihrer Leistungen ein. Und in diesem Zusammenhang initiierte sie den Ankauf von Mary Miss Knots über die Galerie Ropatsch. Ihr ist also diese Entdeckung, diese Neuerwerbung sowie dieser festliche Abend zu verdanken. Und da gilt unser großer Dank der Tatjana und das ist einen großen Applaus verdient. Verbunden mit einem herzlichen Dank, und ich spreche, glaube ich, auch im Namen von dir, Tatjana, nochmals an die International Patrons of the Pinakothek sowie an unsere Kolleginnen in der Museum- und Ausstellungstechnik, der Restaurierung, Kommunikation und Veranstaltung. Ich übergebe nun das Wort und wünsche Ihnen einen inspirierenden Abend.
Thank you, Verena, for this very, very kind introduction. And thank you, Mary Miss, for being here tonight, for traveling from New York City to grace us with your presence and to give us an insight not just into your artistic career, but really into your life's work. So I'm very pleased and honored to be able to have this conversation here tonight in Munich and to present the work of Mary Miss to the public of Munich. Just a quick idea of how we will have the conversation. We will talk around 50 minutes between each other and present some images, and we will have a chronological path through the works of Mary Miss, and then we will offer the floor to you to ask questions and to take the chance to have a personal interaction with Mary Miss. So let's dive into it. This is our first image. I'm pressing the green button.
I must say it's very easy to sit at a coffee table and have a conversation very casually with Tatjana. We'll see if we can do it in front of a room full of people.
But like always, we were trying to avoid the topics that we were going to discuss here, because otherwise you get into the habit of practicing. You have to say this tomorrow, you have to say this tomorrow. So here we have the first image. It's a juxtaposition of the work Knots that you created in 1969 in New York City in your first studio in a basement setting. You can see knots are laid out around a fairly dark room, and this is now contrasted with the way that we present knots in 2023. The work was recreated in 2020 and therefore has a double date. And I just like how these two images show what a far way the work of art has come, but also how far you've come, which we will, of course, address in the different stages of your work. But just to get us started into the atmosphere of New York City as a young artist, just freshly graduated, you came back to the city. You were born there, but you spent your life traveling quite a lot. And so you returned to New York City after you finished your MFA and start working in the studio. So what was it like, and how was maybe not a representation or a conceptual outcome of your feelings in this very first time?
Well, it was, this time of arriving in New York and not knowing people, and had this studio up on East 96th Street in the basement of a building. And I had a pit bull terrier. I don't know if you know what those are, but they're fighting dogs. And there was quite a lot of bad activity on the streets and rats in the basement, but this dog was very good at handling anything that came my way. But I would go into this dark studio, and I was reading Russian novels at the time, and sitting in this dark studio working away. Sometimes I wonder how I ever got out of the studio, because it was a kind of grim place. But it was also a place to just begin to try to imagine. And I had started in graduate school. I was watching the people around me. I was the only woman in the graduate school, and there was a lot of welding and bronze casting, and I just was very uncomfortable with that as a way of working, and was trying to imagine a different way, a different path forward. And so that's kind of the beginning of this body of work. And this cramped quarters of the basement, I had spent, although I was born in New York, I spent most of my time in the West as I was growing up. And so everything I was doing, I was trying to imagine that it could expand, that it could go through the floor, that those knots were just the top of something that was extending below, or that it could go beyond the walls. But I'm trying to trick myself into not being so confined.
And this conceptual understanding or engagement with the notion of infinity, did this come from the literature you were reading? How did you have this universal, because that's probably also one of the biggest appeals of knots. Wherever you present it, it has this ability to speak to any public, whatever educational background, whatever cultural background. The knot has such a strong symbolic meaning in a religious way or in a profane way. So I wonder how this concept of infinity was something that was just conceptually triggering you to translate it into material language.
I'm not sure I know. I can't name it exactly, really.
Intuitively.
But this idea that the grid had been taken away and only the knots were left. I did a small piece at that time that was about 4 feet square that was a knotted grid. And here I've just gotten rid of the linear part and left the knots in place.
And here we already are in this moment when you're already stretching these definite and rigid rules of minimalism. So you're already moving beyond them, and if you wanted to put it in some sort of category into a post-minimalist sort of direction, even though minimalism and postmodernism, they consisted all the time, and the terminology was never coined by the artists, but by the art critics of the time. So I wonder if you want to jump already at this notion of minimalism, that when we look at it, we think it's so minimal because the material is minimal, the gestures are minimal, but it's not really minimalist in the sense of the art historical period, right?
Well, I think, you know, there are things that drew me towards minimalism, but there were things that I wasn't so interested in. But the relationship that was set up, that was insisted upon between the viewer and what they were looking at, was the part that really interested me. You know, that viewer engagement. But I think I focused on that rather than the physical form.
Yes, makes sense.
That became more important.
So apart from being in the studio a lot of the times, and I think that this image also gives us a good impression of what it was really like to come to New York in the late 60s, because sometimes it is written about this time when everything was possible, and we will get into the feeling of possibilities a bit later, but in terms of also locations, that the lofts were available and the artists could transfer them into studios, but it also shows the reality that it took quite some handiwork, or it had, you were still in confined spaces, even though property was cheaper than, of course, in the contemporary times.
Yes, definitely. And a loft wasn't possible at this point. I was in an apartment on the Upper East Side that cost $49 a month. And I think that's one of the things I regret now for young artists, you know, that possibility of coming to a place and being able to have space, even if it's a basement.
But you took space, and not just imaginary space, but real space in the sense of the outskirts, the environment, and you started to translate your gestural works into the landscape. So this is one of the earliest pieces, Ropes and Shore, and maybe, I don't know if you can see it well on the black and white photograph, but I allow you to explain what it was and how it was perceived. And
so this is on an island in the East River, and there are ropes that were weighted with a rock, pulled taut and staked every 20 feet along about a half mile of that edge of the island. And, you know, in this interest of mine in not having the singular object, of not having the hollow piece in front of you or the signpost, really kind of tying the work into the land was really interesting to me. And the kind of physicality of the viewer, I talked about that, you know, that interest that I had, that you had to walk the whole edge of this island. So this is very unimpressive, you know, to see just a single rope, but if you walk that whole edge, you know, this isn't Christo, this isn't theater, you know, this is just slowly walking along the edge and kind of seeing, really paying attention to the relationship between the land and the water. Water is something that's been part of my work from this earliest period. It keeps coming back again and again. But, you know, I was really happy to get out of that confined studio and be able to do a project like this.
so how did you attract audiences, or rather, what was was this already the time when you started rethinking who could be the audience to an artwork? Because it is so unnoticeable on the one hand, but then so peculiar to imagine you are by the shoreside and you're walking in the park and suddenly you see these ropes attached and you wonder who brought them there, how did they get there? But so I'm wondering, did you bring part of your friends, of your artistic surroundings, I mean other artists, to the shore, or were you also sometimes just there and going into direct interaction with passers-by, people who were passing by?
Well, I found out from someone that Charlotte Moorman, who was the person who collaborated with Nam June Paik quite a bit, Charlotte Moorman was organizing this weekend festival. So I spent maybe a week putting this up for a 2-day event. So there were people that were there. But it's still, it's like, if you're talking about the relationship of that person who's looking at the work, it's me trying to figure out different ways of establishing that. And in this case, it was because you had to take the time, but it wasn't me yet thinking specifically about the audience in the way that that kind of evolved as time went on.
But what we can see clearly is that you're already shifting the perspective away from the object itself. So that is also a big and interesting difference to the minimalist work, that it becomes more about having these multiple perspectives within which to perceive a work. This was already happening in the situation of the knots in the basement. It is certainly happening with the way we display knots. So whenever you come back, and please feel invited to visit the installation in room 34, you can walk around it, and you are invited to walk around it so that you have multiple views of the work. And so here you have this pathway that goes that moves forward, but in general it becomes more about shifting the lens of the viewer away from the object towards the landscape, towards the surrounding area. And I think that's very telling also with the next example we have from this period, because this barbed wire marker, I can admit to the audience, admit to you, Mary, I already admitted to you yesterday, I was wondering when I was looking at this object, but why is it a marker? Is the wood supposed to demark the wire? So what you see are these 3 wooden poles, and then they are held together in a way by a barbed wire. And I just couldn't make out what the marker was, because we know the text marker. But here I was falling into the trap of thinking about it as an artwork, as an object that is an artwork. And then you revealed to me that it was actually something else.
Well, I was really, again, here I am, this young artist, really trying to figure out how to move forward, how to think, how to work, how to make something in a different way. And what really interested me was the idea that if this was on a piece of, on sand or on a piece of paper and it rolled along, it would leave this tattoo behind. So that marking of it that was possible. Now, how many people were going to make that connection? Not very many, but that was the thing that really interested me, that this thing could leave its mark. But at the same time, it's kind of off-putting because it's barbed wire. It would leave a mark on your hand if you tried to lift it. So, again, that kind of visceral, physical connection.
And the work of art becoming a tool, a vehicle to create some sort of, even if just ephemeral, relationship to the viewer and the landscape. However, now we've had these delicate examples of your early oeuvre, but there's also works that had a very bulky presence, and even to the extent of taking up the whole space of, here again, we are back in the basement studio, and clearly obstructing not just the view, but also obstructing the body. Mm-hmm. So how did this notion of obstructing and creating some sort of border come into place?
Again, there's that me imagining that these fences are continuing beyond the room, beyond the walls, with the ropes. I was telling Tatjana that I did a series of photographs of 2 people as though they're wading through water, stepping through the ropes, a series of, tracing the movement. But that making you question the space that you're in, and not allowing the access was a physicality, you know, in another way that I was thinking about or looking at. It's funny to see these works in different kinds of spaces. I just redid this one at the Aldrich Museum. Lucy Lepard did a show in 1973 or 26 contemporary women artists. And they redid the show last year on the 50th anniversary. And I didn't have the wood anymore and used fresh wood. And somehow I wasn't comfortable with it. I liked the darkness of my studio and what it looked like then. I don't like the knots piece in the photographs very well, but I like what it looks like in the space. But it's very different. It looks so cool, and but when I see it in the museum, I really like seeing it there. So.
Interesting how the context always influences the perception and sort of like the psychological impact of the work. And in fact, I have a somewhat bold question, and you may answer as far as you want, or maybe you're not even going to perceive it as bold, but I was wondering, in those times, being a woman artist and working on these projects, somewhat in the basement studio, then having to demount them again, not even being able often to store them, was this preoccupation with abstraction also a reflection of how you were sometimes feeling, and not just as an individual artist, but also as a group of female artists, of how there were these systemic obstructions in your way and not giving you access to certain spaces such as galleries. There was a real bias in the art world of buying certain artists, oftentimes male and white artists, and female artists that were working really closely with the male artists, so they were not even working or practicing in a secluded area. You were very close friends with Saul Levitt, for instance, whom we also have in the collection, and maybe we will also make some juxtaposition at some point later with your work and his. So where I'm heading is, was it also somewhat maybe on a subconscious level, or even a very conscious level, a reflection of having to do with all these boundaries that were in place?
I think so, and you know, these aren't exactly kind works, you know, barbed wire and keeping you out of a space, and you know, there was definitely, you know, how do you invent a different way of getting, of having people be able to respond to the work, was what I was constantly asking myself. What are the references that people made themselves to the work? So it's not as though that was a conscious decision on my part, but I think, you know, there was this feeling of, you know, at this point I hadn't met so many other women, in the late 60s. It wasn't until I moved downtown and into a loft space that, you know, I started meeting others. You know, I was choosing this path that I knew was very different from my colleagues in school, in graduate school. So it's interesting to hear all the stories about Boyce and Palermo and, you know, all the people who were working together and being encouraged, you know, to try new things. And that wasn't my situation, really. It was, you know, I don't feel comfortable with what these people are doing. You know, I've got to find a different way of thinking and working.
A very bold and confrontational way, as speaks from these works. And again, a contrast that starts to appear more and more in the 70s. This is one of your early projects that have this sort of land art appeal to them. You created this one in the Battery Park City landfill, so where nowadays, where we have Battery Park City in New York City, there was this landfill, and from how I understand, it was covered in sand. This is the sort of technicality of a landfill, and then what you see, these black stripes on top of it, was actually oil that was spread on the surface so that the sand would not just fly around. It looks very wintry and kind of like a cold and icy landscape, but that's the background to it. And so Lucy Lippard, whom we've mentioned here again, a very famous art historian and critic of those times, and more importantly, a close friend of yours, she critiqued the work, and she said she had this very beautiful sort of idea about it, where it was this air that is, maybe the next image is going to show it better, before I keep talking. Oops, sorry, to go back. This thing needs a new battery. Here we are. Like a sort of string of air that is cutting through the wood. So, yeah, maybe how did you think of the lightness and the wood contrast?
I love doing this project. I had a small grant from the New York State Council on the Arts. By the way, the rope pieces, you know, you're a young artist and you have no money, and one of the things is you can buy a lot of rope for, you know, not too much money. And with this project, I really loved it because you came into the site from the side gate, and this is just very close to where the World Trade Center is now. But the excavation for the World Trade Center was put into the Hudson River, and it was landfill, and that's you know, been built up with apartment buildings since then. But when you came into the site, you didn't see anything. You just saw these thin boards. So it was kind of a shock when you walked around to the front, and there was this column of air going into the ground. And all of a sudden, the project materialized from being nothing. And so I was very, very happy with that kind of way of creating an experience, an engagement. So all of these are about how, you know, what's the form of the engagement, you know? How do you not just have it be a signboard? How do you get a visceral response from the person who's looking?
And it's very beautifully mirrored in this article from '73 by Lucy Lippard, because she really starts out with telling us how approaching this work of art was sort of very, again, not spectacular. You just saw the wooden frames, and if you're coming from the side, you were kind of wondering how this small intervention in this huge landfill can have any sort of impact on you as a sort of emotional impact, until you take a turn and you go up to it frontally, you look through this perception, as you can see here now, and she also used the word crystallized, the air crystallized, and suddenly the sculpture becomes an air sculpture, very beautifully and so poetically. And I think this moment of not looking for the spectacle, but looking for this poetic sparkle and poetic surprise is what is a very beautiful aspect of your artistic
Well, you know,
language.
there's going to be a show at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas next September of women and, in quotes, land art. And of course, the men's work was called land art. And it'll be about 12 artists, of course, Nancy Holt and Alice Aycock and Agnes Dennis and Michelle Stewart and a number of other people. I'm really looking forward to seeing this because I think we were probably all, but I know I was, again, as this, you know, feisty young artist, rejecting the Smithson and Heiser and that approach that they were taking, feeling that they could go out on the desert and make their mark. And I, as I said, I spent so much time in the West when I was growing up. And I knew that you couldn't impose on that land. You know, it doesn't matter how big the spiral is, it's never going to impose on that landscape. You know, that these were flimsy boards was kind of my counter to things that were big and done with bulldozers.
That's very impressive to want to create your own artistic language and not take model of certain other artists that were getting more funding. Also, it's always a question of patronage and who was supporting these artists to do these huge installations in the deserts as well. I was just wondering, you were saying something and it slipped my mind. Oh, the Nasher Museum. Well, you are, of course, in it too. So you're part of that generation that they're trying to sort of reawaken and introduce to the public now in the present times. I like that sometimes you had also the switch to, and we're kind of going more and more into this time and the decade that we're approaching in the next slide, which will be the 80s. But here it's already featuring sort of this idea of a trap and of a playful engagement. So sometimes almost like purposefully confusing your audience and triggering them to discover, is that something I can step on? Is it, what's the use of that?
I don't know, this idea of the infinite extension was always really compelling to me. So the question that came to me, does it look like this grid is going under the ground that I've just walked across? And you get up to the edge of it and it's kind of like a trap, but it's made out of flimsy wood. This is at the Oberlin Museum, Allen Memorial Museum in Oberlin, Ohio. And Ellen Johnson was the art historian who was there at the time, a really wonderful woman. And they commissioned this as a permanent work, and it was made out of metal so that it could be there. And I didn't like it, I have to say. And something strange happened, which I don't know if it's a true story, but this is what I was told, is that not long after the work was completed, somebody was being chased by the police, and the person fell into this. And of course it was metal, so that was and since then it's been covered up, and every 10 years or so the museum contacts me and says, we're going to find a way to show this work, but this was, the permanent form was done in 1974, so I'm not sure it's really going to ever see the light of day again. But you know, this is another piece where you don't see it until you get up to the edge of it, and yet it gives a fairly, you know, visceral response. You know, trap or not trap, or, you know, what is that?
Turned out to be a trap for someone.
What?
Turned out to be a trap.
Turned out to be a trap, yeah, right. But, you know, I've mentioned that interest I have in people moving through and walking with these projects. And I wrote something not too long ago where I was reflecting on that, because even in my most recent work, walking is really an important part of this. And, you know, it wasn't something that I was planning. What, like you say, did I do the kind of work I was doing in response to the position women were in? Not consciously, but you know, walking the streets of New York in the 1970s as a young woman was a challenge. You know, it wasn't safe. It was, you had to think about how you dressed. You know, you didn't want to attract attention to yourself. And it's almost as though by insisting that walking was a part of the work, I was challenging that idea, you know, that movement, that freedom of movement that I felt I deserved, you know, that all women would deserve. I'm talking about this, you know, some of you are art historians in the room, and feminism and artists working within a feminist vocabulary has been really narrowly defined. You know, a certain kind of imagery, a certain kind of material, most often painting, has become to define feminist art. And I think that something like walking, or the fact that you're thinking about other places than museums and galleries that art could be seen, that who would the audience be? Those are questions that became, as I went on, more and more important. How could you make something and put it out in a public place, and whether or not you knew art history, that you would be able to relate to it? So I think in the decades to come, we can hope that things will not be quite so narrowly defined. But we're looking at a couple of photographs of a group of women who, I moved downtown at a certain point. I had a chance to meet a lot of other women artists, and this idea of changing the world seemed pretty easy to us. It seemed like something we should be able to take on. It turned out not to be quite as easy as we thought, but we formed this collective to create a journal, Heresies, and this is a retreat when we were planning how we were going to proceed with this. And I think you're the expert, not me. You know how long it lasted. Was it 10 years? Or?
No, it went on until 1992, but
Really?
also because there came sort of a second generation. So the founding generation was from 76, to which you belong. You're one of the founding members. And then it kind of, in the late 80s, there were some challenges also with the conservative backlash in the United States politics landscape. And then there was a new new group of women who tried to continue the work until 1992. So Heresies is one of the examples that lasted very long regarding the other publications and collectives that...
Many of us fell by the wayside, as being in a collective isn't as easy as it's made out to be sometimes.
Yeah, I was looking at these images because I'm studying the heresies in my research, and it was filled with so much nostalgia and thinking, why are we not creating this women retreats? And then we started speaking, and of course also very quickly in our first conversation, it also came, the question came around friction and opinions that diverge from each other. But I think for the early days, what was really remarkable is what you were saying, and this is also the intention of this artist talk and spreading the word, that feminism took so many different shapes and forms and media, and was not, I mean, there are a group of painters, but even within the painters, like Harmony Hammond, who is an abstract painter in this group picture. She's the one with the back facing Mary Miss in the photograph on the right. But she was working in completely abstract aesthetics and almost writing a manifesto saying that there needs to be a recognition that feminism can be transported through abstract vocabulary. So I think you found these like-minded people, and then you said something interesting to me. It sparked a sense for collectivity that continued on forever, right?
Yes. I think I've ended up doing things later in my career that the seeds were planted, that one could work in a collective way. So those experiences as a young woman were really important. And before the talk, we were speaking, and it just was, for a long time, people couldn't figure out the 70s because it wasn't abstract expressionism, it wasn't minimalism. There were so many things going on, but for those of us who got to be young artists at that time, it was just an incredibly interesting time. We were crossing territories. I was interested in what Yvonne Rainer was doing as a dancer, or what the musicians, Phil Glass, or we weren't staying in our lanes, and it was really very, feeding you as an artist to have these exchanges with other disciplines, with other artists.
And again, the notion of dismantling things, which then kind of transports into the aesthetics of your work. I really, really like the quote of you where you said, to me, the 1970s were about dismantling things, whether that was the role of women, the idea of sculpture, or the notion of appropriate content. So I think that speaks very clearly for so many of your works. I will move a bit faster because I really want to have the time for the audience to see your current work, but this is a very important project because it became so, it extended so much in scale. We chose this photograph for you to have an idea of what it was. It was on this Nassau County Museum, sort of the outside area of it, and you came to this field and you saw these pavilions, like 3 of them, and then shall I continue and have you?
I think, again, that idea of not trying to take over the landscape was really important to me. So if you're standing at the edge, you see that there are 3 of these tower-like structures, but the one near the entrance that you come in to, if you could go back, is really...
It's creating a life of its own.
You need somebody to give you a boost if you wanted to go up into that center part. When you get to the smallest one, which you might presume is small because it's in the distance, you can see it between the legs of this one. It's so small that if you're a little overweight, you can't get into it. So you have to go around and investigate for yourself to really understand what is there. So these are in a lower field, and then if you go to the next slide.
Sure.
There is a double mound of earth. I'm pointing to this as though you can see what I'm pointing at, but...
if I use the pointer, it starts jumping, yeah, but I will still do, there's these mounds, right?
Separates the lower field from this upper field, and then you come to this opening in the ground with a ladder, and once you go into it, this was the early drawing for it. It turned out instead of 3 passages, 3 doorways, there was only a single doorway in each side, but you went into a passageway that then had windows cut into it, and behind that second wall, it was excavated, and it was so dark that you really couldn't see how far it was excavated underneath there. So it was, again, like with that one at Oberlin, that you don't know how far it extends under the ground you've come across. Here, you don't know how far the ground is excavated because of the darkness that you're looking into. So this was something, I told you that the circular piece with the circles lining up was really an important work for me, and this was another one that was so important, that this was in a county museum. This wasn't necessarily art patrons coming. When I say museum, it was more like a history museum. It wasn't like people involved in contemporary art necessarily, but I felt that I was giving experiences in these architectonic spaces that would be very compelling to people, even without a greater background. So there's this it's not a large figure on the landscape, and yet it's a very concentrated experience once you get there.
I think it has this playground association to it when you first come across it, and you actually understand that all of these elements are that you can enter them in some ways. But then especially once you're inside this lower structure, it takes a turn almost and becomes very metaphorical. This is what I was also asking you, and wanted to bring this notion to the audience as well, of where can you go through, which pathway is blocked, where you have to take a turn. It becomes about decision making that then translates into different life experiences that each and every one has in their own ways. But now that I'm looking at it, it's so much also about the ground and the earth, And it speaks sort of to the next piece that we brought to the talk, which is also about, again, engaging different perspectives and different ways of how to move around. You also have pavilions in this one, but you also have this very, very beautiful little almost entrance into the pond, which you can see here on the right. So we are moving more and more towards works of art that are becoming less about being an architectural sculpture, but becoming something that also triggers notions of the ecology, the environment, and the specifics of a place, right?
So I think there are a lot of works that we aren't showing, that we're skipping over, but in those early pieces that I was doing through the 70s and 80s, the relationship between the built and natural environment was something that I was really curious about, and the kind of collision that takes place, especially in the Western landscape. If you see the Hoover Dam, it is this amazing engineered structure put into the landscape, or oil refineries, those things that I would see out of the back of the car as we were driving, moving from one state to another as I was a young person. And but it was an abstract relationship. But here, this was in Des Moines, Iowa. It was for the Des Moines Art Center, a project that was done. But what was really interesting to me was to take this derelict pond and try to create a wetland that would filter the water that was running off the streets into this pond. And I worked with a science center that was nearby, with a garden club, to work out what would be planted, about how the kids from the science center would interact. But in what I was trying to do, I was in the series of things that you encountered as you went around this site, I was trying to kind of make you think about this relationship to the land that you were exploring. And kind of the centerpiece was this cut in the water where you could sit on a bench and look out at eye level with the water. That kind of visceral placing you into the water was really important. But one of the things I really missed, there was a wonderful botanist who was taking me around to see the different wetlands and telling me what all the plants were. And a Native American took me out to a nearby reserve and talked to me about the traditions. And these layers of content in the site were really interesting to me, and I wondered if there wasn't some way that could be revealed to others who came. But it was just something I was beginning to think about.
But now we have this notion of the audience and how to create more interactive points within an installation comes into your work and leads the way into this current phase. So we're, as you said, we've taken quite a quick ride through the different periods of the 20th century, but we're approaching the 21st century, and suddenly there is this, this huge shift and not just shift, I'm even, there is no word to describe the tragedy that happens in New York City with the World Trade Center. And your studio, by now you are in Tribeca, is just really down the street from where the World Trade Center is, and then where Ground Zero happens to be. And when this shocked the nation, it affected you as a resident of that area as well, and as someone who was very close by physically. So you came up with a project that became very telling for where you're now.
Right. So in this skipping over that we've been doing, I spent a good part of the 90s proposing projects that never got built, because here I was, in this, what art historians were calling the expanded field. It's what interested me, is being out in the world and trying to build things, which is fine, except when it comes to the budget, the art was always the thing that would be cut first. So I would do a proposal and then it wouldn't happen, and I would work another 2 or 3 years on a proposal and it wouldn't happen. I was getting fed up by this point. And so as wonderful as it was to be able to create a space, a cut in the water, to have the opportunity to actually get something built, it just wasn't happening. So then 9/11 happens down the street from me, and over a period of time, of months, there were hordes of people coming to first 14th Street, and then down to Houston Street, and then down to Chambers Street. And they were put in the position of coming as voyeurs to see this tragedy. And, I'm in the midst of this, watching it. My place was covered in dust. My assistants and I cleaned the place as well as we could. And we started thinking about what we could do. And we came up with this idea of trying to create a perimeter, a different kind of perimeter that would allow people not to come as voyeurs, but to come as mourners. So we had this idea that instead of the police barriers, those kind of sawhorses that police use in New York City anyway to stop people, that we would create these curved pieces with pipe, and that people would be asked to bring flowers so that everybody could come as a mourner. So that was such an important thing to happen, to think about, that there would be a way to, with something quite simple, this stringing together these pipes, you could create an experience for the viewer. You could change their experience completely by just asking them to be engaged in a direct way. In place of the chain link fences, we wanted to do these curved wire mesh pieces where people would be encouraged to leave their messages. For 15 years after the 9/11, I'd run into people in my neighborhood coming from Germany. I'd meet somebody from a small town in Germany. Our village has, everyone has signed this card, and is there any place we can leave it? Now there's a museum and there's a place for, but you would meet people from all over the world wanting to leave some kind of memento or token, and there was no way to do that. And the fantasy was that I had, I never would have dreamed it would take as long as it took to get the new buildings up. But I had imagined that the site could be surrounded with these containers with flowers, so that in fact there would be a wreath around the site for the whole time that the reconstruction was happening. This project didn't happen, but it was such an important one for me to kind of imagine this way of doing things. And I felt the way to kind of celebrate when this was, when the site was rebuilt, that those elements that had held flowers could be put in this figure 8 kind of knot with candles at the top to kind of celebrate the site coming together again. So this is happening at the turn of the century, and it starts a whole different way of thinking that I could operate as an artist.
And we both decided to specifically include this project because, as you just mentioned, 9/11, the waves, they went over New York City, over the United States to impact the whole world. But also because in the context of the formal language that you used in '69 with the work that we acquired, the knots, and here we have the reappearance of a knot, only that it becomes a knot that is being created by the people, by their movement, and also this idea of having an infinity knot, which kind of expresses of how the process of mourning also transcends into infinity and doesn't have a certain starting point and a certain ending point. So that was just a very beautiful, symbolic, formal proposal that you also included into all the socially engaged aspects that came along with it.
But I think there was something else I experienced at the time that was so important. I mean, place-based work, I'm like a dinosaur in the new era of media and how people communicate, because I insist that place-based experience is so important, and I think what happened when the first days after this tragedy, we weren't allowed into the neighborhood, and I was staying with friends on 86th Street, and people were in cafes, having normal lives. And it's like we all are. We watch television and see these horrible things that are happening around the world, and then we go back to our, lives. So people would watch on television over and over as the planes crash in, but it's all this mediated experience. It's not a direct experience. So something that I've really, felt compelled to try to do is make things happen in the world in real time, in real place, in real space. And it's something I just feel passionate about.
And this brings us to the most current stage of your practice. Just for the sake of time, because I do want to give some space to the audience to ask questions, maybe you would like to tell the story of City as Living Laboratory and how it came about from Park as Living Laboratory in one, and then we just skip the video and we transition into Watermark.
Yes, I was working as the artist on a team that was looking at this 1,500-acre park in Southern California. The project never finally happened, but in thinking about this is like in 2005-06, I'm thinking, all right, I know that the art budget always gets cut right away, so I'm not going to even pretend that we're going to get a lot built into this park. Instead, I want to think of this park as a laboratory where artists can come over a period of decades and look at ways that in the environment of Southern California, which is basically a desert, how could people begin to understand a different relationship to the landscape? And so we were calling this a park as a living laboratory. When this didn't happen, I took those ideas and I felt they were so important, to make sure that artists could be an essential part of our trying to look at the world and figure out a different way to live in it. So I started thinking about this not as a park, as a laboratory, but as to look at cities. So in about, 2010 or 11, I started a nonprofit that was about artists collaborating with scientists or other experts and communities to work on the streets in neighborhoods to engage people through art in projects that would allow them to reconsider their relationship to the natural systems and the infrastructure that supports their lives. And we've, over this decade and a half that we've been doing this, we've come up with this kind of toolkit of how we do this, where, we organize walks in neighborhoods, and then we involve community members very directly. Then we do workshops and find out what issues are important to people. And then we ask artists to do proposals. Now you see, I'm not talking just about my work here, I'm talking about artists in plural. I feel like the issues that we have, that we're dealing with in the environment, are so complex that we really need to think of constellations of artists being able to, go into cities and address the issues, or into the countryside. And so something that's been interesting to me is, okay, I'm coming up with a conceptual framework of the city as living lab, but trying to engage as many artists as possible. And then in the next project we'll be talking about, that I've been working on for about a decade, we're actually being able to make this happen at the scale of the city. So you get it by this point that I've got this obsession with having something expand as far as it possibly could. And then I've mentioned that I've worked with water very often. So about, 2014, I was invited to Milwaukee, and a group of people came together and asked me if I would do a project to focus on water in this city. I think has one of the largest population of German immigrants. It was a city of breweries, and beer was kind of the starting point for its growth. But the water of Lake Michigan and the water coming off the land into Michigan, Lake Michigan, and protecting it was so important. But when I started, there was this wonderful engineer who oversaw the sewage treatment of the whole area, of more than just the city, but the city and county. And he said, anything that you do really has to be for the whole city. You can't look at a singular place. At the same time, I was talking to climate scientists, and they were saying, Mary, you can't just do a single piece, but it really has to be something that happens at scale. So this is fine, but nobody had a few $1 million to throw at this. They had enough money to, have me work on it for a year. So I'm thinking, how can I do something at the scale of the city in a very modest way? And there is a stack at the edge of Lake Michigan at the water treatment plant. And the stack, I thought I would repurpose and have it lit blue, and it's vapor lit blue night to night. But if there was going to be a chance of a sewage overflow or any kind of threat to the water of Lake Michigan, it would turn red. So I wanted to appropriate this piece of infrastructure and turn it into something else. But then I wanted this to be something that people would know about through the whole city. So I was looking at maps and atlases, and there would be a key at the side, with letters or numbers calling out the points of on the map. And I thought, what if we could actually do that in a city, at the scale of the city, have these points called out? And so this idea of doing an atlas of water for the city of Milwaukee evolved, so that we'd go into neighborhoods across the city, work with them, doing the walks and the workshops, finding out what the issues were in a particular neighborhood. And then in the workshop that we do with the community, they decide what the words, what the letter is that they want to represent them. So I call what I'm doing the slow cooking version of art making, because I've been at this since 2014, and these markers just went up about 2 weeks ago. So it wasn't until we got a large grant from the National Science Foundation, who were willing to support an artist, that was pretty shocking, that we were able to start this. When these are mostly in underserved neighborhoods where some of the biggest issues are, flooding happens, and people don't have Wi-Fi. So these are solar powered, they're Wi-Fi hotspots that people can come to. And once they get there, there are short videos, interviews with people in the neighborhood. So if I mentioned earlier talking about the Des Moines wetland project and how I wished people could know those other layers. They don't have to, but it's available if they want to. And then that I'm coming in with this conceptual framing, but each of the artists, each of the neighborhoods has an artist who does a project in conjunction with the marker. In the previous slide that you got a glimpse of that. In this neighborhood, it's a Spanish-speaking neighborhood, and they wanted to make it clear to people that was the case. And when we were there last week, one of the neighbors came up and said, you know, this is really a poor working class neighborhood, and the new immigrants who are kind of flooding into this state now come in and see this marker, and they feel like it's okay, you know, there's something familiar. So this is going to be across the whole network that over the next 10 years, by the end of this year, we'll have 9 of the markers up. I hope in another 10 years, we'll have a couple dozen more up. But if you can imagine that marker at the edge of Lake Michigan, I call it the mothership for these smaller markers. By the way, if the markers turn, if the stack turns red and the vapor turns red, what happens if there's a possibility of a problem with the water in Milwaukee? These letters pulse so that people in these neighborhoods know not to use their bathtubs or big uses of water, so that everybody in the city gets to be part of this green infrastructure and support. So sometimes I wonder how I ended up in this territory, but you know, it seemed like you could just change the world, right? You know, as a young woman, that collective spirit of heresies, you know, it's something that stayed with me.
But I think since you are since you're building this bridge and making the connection between your early work and the work you're doing now, this project in Milwaukee is so multi-layered, but when you take this aerial view of it and what it is supposed to become, all these various dots, and actually it's not just dots, it's precisely knots, because that's where the connecting happens, that's where people meet, maybe because they use the Wi-Fi at the same moment and then they get to interact or chat, or just also this amazing feature of the warning if something is wrong. So it really becomes a signifier, and therefore its characteristic is the marker's characteristic is truly some sort of a symbolic knot. So we have kind of taken a full circle from the beginning of your practice, from the work that we've acquired to the work that you're doing now in the present day outside in the streets of these cities such as Milwaukee. And I think we're just filled with pride and honor that we get to be part of your journey, in the sense of having a piece here in Munich that introduces your name and your doing to the audience here. And with these words, I would like to open the floor, as promised, to questions and comments and the possibility to speak to Mary Miss. We have another microphone. There is a question in the back.
First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering about your choice of materials early on in your career. You mentioned the practicality of the choices that you sometimes made, and that also that some commissions required the materials to be converted. I'm thinking of entitled 1973, from flimsy wood into metal. And I was wondering whether you considered at the time the longevity of the materials, what it would mean if the wood or the rope decayed, and whether that was an intentional choice or whether you were more ambivalent to the idea of that decay.
Decay wasn't something that I was really incorporating into the work. Almost all of the early projects, the large-scale projects, were temporary works, and to be able to see something materialize, to be able to, you know, walk through it or have others interact directly was the thing that I was really passionate about. And the fact that the underground structure with the 3 towers was only, it took me a year to build by myself with a young student in the beginning, and then I got a couple people who knew a little bit more about carpentry at the very end when I was doing the towers. You know, somehow it didn't faze me that it took a year to build and it was only up for a year, even though I wish it was still there. But thinking in taking decay and into consideration was also, most of the works had to be removed so they wouldn't be there very long.
More questions? In the front.
Maybe possible to start this way. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's already here.
Mary, my name is Klaus. In the early years, it appears, you have been a typical artist coming up with the knots. You make a piece of art, and viewers think or do not think different things maybe about the meaning of it. And the later stages, which you and Tatjana have discussed, are, it appears to me, a lot about influencing people's behavior. You think about what do people do at ground zero, and you try to give more meaning, to help them to have more meaning in their behavior. And of course, in Milwaukee and the Des Moines projects appear to be in the same direction. It's less you leave a piece of art, it's more you help people to behave. Is this something which is typical for you, or do you think it's typical for modern day artists?
I'm not interested in staying in the art context. I'm interested in getting out into this expanded field and into the world. And yet it's not happening, and because of budget cuts and things like that. And at the same time, that kind of abstract look that I was taking at the relationship between the built and the natural environment, turn of the century, all of a sudden it's not abstract, it's very serious. You know, you're realizing that there are such important issues that are going to be impacting all of us. And so it's the pressure of what's happening and the frustration of not being able to be working in the world. And I think that it was like this passionate feeling that I had that artists needed to be part of this essential group that's helping us all to find new paths forward. So if you've got the people who are doing policy, if you've got the people who are the teachers, the scientists, I think the artists need to have that a place at the table, and they're equal to what those other roles may be, and probably even more important because of the ability to engage people, to engage the imagination. So I just feel like whether I do it in a way that is more, communicating content, or other people do it another way, I think artists have this gift of engaging people in the sense that scientists are not able to. I've been collaborating a lot with ecologists and environmental engineers who are totally frustrated because they've got the data, they're trying to give it to people and nobody's paying attention, especially in the US, you know. But artists have a way of starting the conversation, of getting people to pay attention that I don't think anybody else has.
That's such a beautiful answer. But we still take a few more questions from the floor because we only had 2, so please feel free to ask away. Can't see anyone. So then, if there's no questions from the audience, I would like to give the word, well, thank you, Mary, for having this conversation, and thank you for being such attentive and interested listeners. But there is one voice that still would like to close the evening. So Mr. von Südow, please come, please take the stage and have the closing word for us.
Dear Mary Miss, dear Royal Highness Herzog Franz von Bayern, dear Professor Marz, dear international patrons, and dear guests and friends of the Pinakothek der Moderne. Herzog Franz, you are the chairman of the board of trustees. We don't translate it this way, but in the American way it would be called like this. You are the Vorsitzende des Kuratoriums of the international patrons of our art promoting association. Some time ago, maybe half a year or so, a year ago, we became aware that in July of 2023, you would celebrate a round number birthday. We were thinking how we could adequately celebrate you and the birthday. So, and it became quickly clear that the international patrons wanted to find a piece of art that we can give to the Staatsgemäldesammlung, honoring you as a passionate collector of contemporary art and one of the formative spirits of the collection for more than maybe 50 years. It was our intention to find an artist that would be a surprise to you and that would not be a look back into your history as a collector. We wanted to follow your advice to look ahead, to look forward. Look into new spheres and find something that was minimal at the same time, a new position in the collection of the Pinakothek der Moderne. Tatjana, whom I really want to thank for a wonderful artist talk together with Mary Miss, she led the approach to find the artist and the work. And I can tell you, Herzog Franz, it was a wonderful process to follow Tatjana, thinking through different ideas. I truly enjoyed it. Tatjana Schaefer finally made Mary Miss and the work Knots her #1 favorite candidate. Mary Miss, your presence in Munich tonight and the conversation we just heard between you and Tatjana Schaefer has given a wonderful insight into your life's work. We are very grateful to you for making the long trip across the ocean to Munich. And I also love the name of your group of artists from the 70s, I have to confess. How do you pronounce this? Heresies? Heresies. Auf Deutsch, die Heretikerinnen. Coming from a more Eastern German family background and being educated in a school in Hamburg that was founded by the father confessor of Martin Luther, Johannes Bugenhagen, the genes and idea of heresy were and are in me from very early on. Mary Miss, your work in the Pinakothek der Moderne will strengthen the role of and gravity of female artists in the Bavarian State Collection. And we love the statement behind the work and its simplicity, the knot, a sign of being intensively intertwined and of being tightly connected, as you are, Herzog Franz, with the art and with New York City. Yeah, the work of Mary Miss contains a certain number of knots, and somehow Tatjana Schaefer managed to convince Mary Miss to have created at least one spare knot. And this one knot is our present to you, Herzog Franz. With this note, we want to thank you for being inspiring for the arts in Bavaria, in Munich, and the Bavarian State Collection, and this your lifelong, and for the fact that you follow a splendid tradition of the Wittelsbach family to care for the art and for artists. So a big thank you to you and a very happy birthday to come.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for having had this impressive talk about an impressive work and life. And thanks to the patrons for having this work now forever in our collection. Thank you, and now enjoy this evening.